What if I told you the Indian government spent a number so large that most people can't visualize it? 53.5 lakh crore. That's the size of India's union budget for 2026 to 27. But before we dig into what that actually means for your life, your job, your rent, your kids' school, we need to back up and understand why this number matters. Because a budget isn't just numbers, it's story, it's a choice, it's a direction for an entire economy. And this year's story begins earlier with something called the Economic Survey. In January 2026, India's government published a report that's basically the economy's health checkup. It said something surprising. India's economy is still growing almost 7.4% a year. And this year, nominal GDP is expected to grow about 10%, which is a big number in macroeconomics. Nominal growth matters because it underpins how much the government thinks it will collect in taxes next year. Meanwhile, inflation has cooled. Interest rates are tamer than they were a couple of years ago. On paper, India looks strong. But, and this is the crucial bit, the survey also warned that strength is uneven. Growth and stability for some, underperformance for others. The economy is like a high speed car with a slightly flat tire. Service sectors and exports are doing well, but manufacturing investment hasn't picked up as fast as economists hoped. And millions of young Indians, despite decent GDP growth, still struggle to find good formal jobs. Foreign investment is good but not yet great. And that flat tire in this economy is structural issue. Now the government had to respond to this diagnosis. Q budget 2026-27. This year's fiscal story is built around two big figures. 12.2 lakh crore in capital expenditure and a fiscal deficit target of 4.3% of GDP. Let's unpack both because this is where the narrative actually begins. Capital expenditure, that's building assets, not salaries, not pensions, not subsidies. Assets, roads, railways, power plants, ports, digital infrastructure. And at 12.2 lakh crore, this is one of the highest capex numbers India has ever seen in a budget. But it gets more interesting. When you include capital grants to states, the money the center gives to states to build infrastructure, this number rises to roughly 17.15 lakh crore. That's nearly one third of the entire government's total spending being used to build assets. In other words, the government is betting big on growth through investment, not just spending to keep the lights on, not just funding welfare programs, but actually building things that improve productivity, the backbone of any long term economic expansion. And why is this important? Because a growing economy needs more than just jobs, it needs productive jobs, connected markets, and physical networks that allow business to flourish. But here's where it gets tricky. To spend more, you usually have to borrow more. Except this budget sets a fiscal deficit target of 4.3% of GDP. That's lower than last year's revised estimate of 4.4% and significantly lower than the 2024 to 25 outturn. In simple terms, the government is trying to spend more and borrow less. That's like saying, I want to renovate my house, buy new furniture, and also cut my credit card bill. It sounds ambitious, and it is. So, how does the government pull it off? There are three big levers. First, keep revenue strong, especially tax revenue. This budget assumes 28.7 lakh crore in net tax receipts. That's money collected from income tax, corporate tax, GST, customs, and other duties. Second, peg nominal GDP growth at about 10%, which boosts revenues because taxes are a percentage of nominal incomes. Third, tighten discretionary spending growth, especially on subsidies and non core welfare outlays. But here's the emotional backdrop of all that. The government wants to show markets and investors, both domestic and global alike, that India is fiscally responsible. Debt is projected at 55.6% of GDP, down marginally from last year. Lower debt is equal to better credit ratings, is equal to cheaper borrowing costs in the future. It's the kind of maths that doesn't make headlines but matters a lot when the Reserve Bank is setting interest rates and the pension funds are allocating capital. Now let's talk about impact, real human impact. Because 53.5 lakh crore sounds huge, but what does it mean for you? Meet Priya, age 26, product manager in Bangalore. She rents a one bedroom apartment. Her monthly take home is 60,000 rupees. She's worried about inflation eroding her savings. She's worried about interest rates on her home loan. This budget emphasizes on fiscal prudence and lowering deficits means inflationary pressure on prices could remain under a check. If inflation stays around 4%, her grocery and rent payments don't spiral, and interest rates, which heavily influence EMI, stay stable. That's subtle but very real. Next, meet Arjun, 34, owner of a small manufacturing unit in Pune. He's been hesitant to expand his factory because credit costs are high and demand is unpredictable. But now, with large infrastructure spending, new logistics corridor, and schemes to support manufacturing clusters, demand signals look stronger. While the budget didn't radically rework tax policy for manufacturers, it did send a signal. We are serious about infrastructure. This matters because infrastructure lowers cost. Cheaper transportation, better power reliability, faster market access. Now meet Rani and Rohan, a farming couple in Madhya Pradesh. They've seen their annual farm income hover around 1.5 to 2 lakh rupees. This budget doesn't suddenly double agricultural spending. In fact, as a share of total federal outlay, agriculture remains around 3%, slightly lower than last year's share. That's a political and economic choice. It means rural support is still there, MSPs, credit, irrigation schemes, but not a huge splash of new funding. For them, the hope is indirect: better rural roads, better supply chains, more market access. Because often the farmers who thrive aren't the ones with subsidies, the ones connected to markets. So, this budget is not just economic policy, it's a political strategy. It shows a government that believes in growth through structural investment rather than short term welfare boosts. That's why infrastructure, not consumption, gets the biggest share of emphasis. But let's be honest, this budget also avoids populism in a year when political cycles are heating up. It doesn't offer big direct cash transfers. It doesn't carve out massive tax rebates for middle income earners. Instead, it offers something less immediately gratifying: stability, confidence, a path to sustained growth. And that's a choice. Now, every budget has a risk. The biggest one here is execution. Infrastructure spending sounds great in a speech, but real projects take time. Roads get delayed, land acquisition disputes slow down projects, state government capacity varies wildly. This matters because 17.15 lakh crore of effective capital spending includes state grants. If states can't absorb construction funds effectively, or if there are bottlenecks, the real economic impact could be lower than the headline numbers. Another risk: the global backdrop. Trade tension, tariff uncertainties, slowing advanced economies. Exports are large and growing. Combined merchandise and service exports topped $825 billion recently. But global demand volatility could slow down growth, which means domestic demand and investment have to pick up slack. And that's not guaranteed. So let's bring this home. What is India's 2026 to 27 budget really? It's a plan to build, not just to sustain, not just to redistribute, but to expand the country's physical and economic capacity. In one line, Budget 2026 to 27 is a fiscally disciplined, investment centric strategy aimed at maintaining 7% real growth while reducing the fiscal deficit to 4.3% and strengthening economic foundations for the next decade. Numbers matter here: 53.5 lakh crore in total spending, 12.2 lakh crore in capital outlay, 4.3% fiscal deficit, 55.6% debt to GDP. On a scale of 1 to 10 for structural ambition, I'd place it around an 8. It's not dramatic, it's not impulsive, it's not headlines first populism, it's long game work. But the biggest risk remains execution, because numbers on paper, no matter how big, only count when they translate into real roads built, factories opened, and jobs created. So here's the question I want you to think about. Would you rather have a budget that gives quick relief or one that tries to build the foundation of your future? Because budget 2026-27 clearly picked the latter. Now tell me, do you think this is ambitious realism or too cautious for a fast growing economy? Drop your thoughts in the comments.